Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Plant Party, all about evergreens, hosted by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Charles Kniper, State Resource Conservationist with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. My co-hosts are Megan Clayton, Professor and Extension Range Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and Tim Sigmund, the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. We have 17 wonderful door prizes we will be giving away as part of today's event. Our door prize donors today are committed to supporting you in our quest for learning about plants. I'd like to thank Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Quell Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas Brigades, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these neat prizes.
All right, everybody, let's get some housekeeping out of the way before we begin. First, we'd like to thank the Texas Section Society for Range Management for giving Plant Party the honor of winning their Outstanding Special Publication Award in 2023. It's great to get recognized for our efforts, but we're really just out here having fun with all of y'all and appreciate your participation as well.
All right, our first presenter today is Courtney Blevins. Courtney gained a degree in forestry from Stephen F. Austin in 1983. He started with the Texas Forest Service in 1984 in East Texas, moving to the West Texas operation in Lubbock in 1987. In 1991, he transferred to Dallas to become the new urban forester for that area, and since 2004 has been the regional forester in the Fort Worth region. He is both a certified forester and board certified master arborist. Courtney will be presenting on tree leafing strategies. Thanks for kicking off our plant party, Courtney.
Well, I've never been asked to talk specifically about leaves before, so this is a new one for me. And also, I've either got a cold or cedar fever or something, so y'all are going to be listening to a frog for the next few minutes here. My apologies for that. Evergreens. What is an evergreen? Well, it's just a plant that has green foliage on it through more than one growing season. There's a lot of trees that fit that bill, but evergreen's really not the proper term. Gymnosperm would be more accurate. Evergreen is just kind of a catch-all term. That's one of the problems with trees in the tree world is there's like 2 or 3 different terms for everything, so it can get kind of confusing. For instance, the opposite of evergreens we call a lot of times call hardwood trees, the trees that lose their leaves in the fall. And there's plenty of those that are not hardwood as some of the evergreens. So don't get too caught up in, I guess, the terminology. I mean, the definition of a tree itself is usually something about a single stem plant, which that's crazy here in Texas. We got lots of multi-stem trees. So anyway, for the purposes of what we're doing, evergreen is just something that's green year-round, and it's going to have that foliage for more than one growing season. So to break it down a little more accurately, a gymnosperm, which is mostly evergreen trees, they have naked seeds. They don't have an ovary that encloses the seed. Not all of them are evergreen, though. There are gymnosperms that drop their leaves each year. If anybody's familiar with ginkgo trees, it's kind of a living fossil that they found a few decades ago, some still surviving in Asia somewhere. And it's a deciduous tree. It loses its leaves every year. Bald cypress, I think most of us are familiar with bald cypress. And it's a conifer, it's a gymnosperm, but it loses its leaves every year. And then, of course, live oaks. A lot of people think live oaks are evergreen, and they're not. They're down here in this next category, angiosperms. They are a deciduous tree. They do lose their leaves every year. They just don't do it in the fall. It's usually in March, which is when my phone starts blowing up because everybody thinks they have oak wilt because their live oak trees are dropping their leaves. Well, it's just, that's what they do. So that's the gymnosperms, which most of them are evergreens. The angiosperms, that has seeds inside an ovary. And perfect example is an apple. When you're eating an apple, you're eating a tree ovary, and it's got seeds in it. And that's an angiosperm. And most of those, in our part of the world anyway, have deciduous leaves. And again, even that live oak that everybody thinks is evergreen, more appropriately called semi-evergreen. But in our part of the world, most of these trees lose their leaves in the fall. Now, you go down to the tropics or something like that, and they'll have leaves year round. But for us, that's our two basic categories. So the leaves, getting to the leaves again, gymnosperm leaves, you got needles like you have on pine trees. You've got scale-like, which you get on junipers, and somebody's talking about junipers later on, which that actually is going to be pretty interesting to me. And then you got the deciduous ones, and then the deciduous and needles. So these pictures down here, like the first one going from left to right and then up, that's pine needles. The next two are actually juniper, the scale-like leaves. And they just look like little fish scales overlapping each other, and they're really tiny. I mean, you got to get up close with a hand lens to really look at those things. That third picture is also juniper leaves, though, and that's juvenile leaves. When they first come out, they can look totally different than what they look like in that second picture when they become mature. And a lot of trees will do that. They have juvenile leaves like mulberry. You can be great at identifying mulberry, but when one's first leafing out, they got goofy looking leaves. Don't look anything like the mature tree. That bottom right one, that's a larch tree. We don't have larch trees around here. That's further north, but it is a conifer and it has needles, but they're deciduous. They drop off every year. And then above that, that's bald cypress, and that very top one, that's ginkgo. So these are all examples of gymnosperm leaves, so they're highly variable, but most of the time, we're looking at needles or scale-like things on the junipers. Another real important point is that even though these things are evergreen, like our pines around here, those needles aren't permanent. They aren't there forever once they develop. They only last a couple of years and they'll drop off. But when they drop off, there's already new green needles there. So the overall effect is the tree is evergreen. They just don't all come off all at once. These pictures here, I get a lot of calls from people thinking they have a disease on their pines. And these pictures just show the normal leaf drop. It's the inner part of the branch. The needles will brown and fall off, and the ends of the branch are still green. That's the new growth out on the ends. That's the old growth in the back. So you see this symptom, it generally just means that's the normal leaf drop after a couple of years. So even though they're evergreen, they do lose those needles. The angiosperm leaves then are, of course, different. And as I said, in our part of the world, they're mostly deciduous and drop all at once. Now, I like this picture on the right here. I just found that yesterday. This house is covered in ivy, and then as fall comes on, the leaves on the ivy change color and I guess eventually fall off. But that's where we go with our angiosperm leaves. So I look a little more closely at the leaf itself. All right, the leaf, we learned this at either junior high, middle school, they call it now, or high school. Somewhere we learned about photosynthesis. And that's what happens in the leaves. That's where the food is made for the tree or the plant. You take sunlight, you take carbon dioxide, you take water, and they put them all together and you make sugar, glucose, food of the tree. So when somebody's trying to sell you an additive to put down in the tree's roots as tree food, that's not accurate. The food comes from the leaves. What they're adding down the soil could be better considered like vitamins or something like that. So there's the whole photosynthesis thing. Really remarkable process and gives us this wonderful byproduct called oxygen, which is kind of useful. But the other thing, the other thing that a lot of times people don't think about down at the bottom is this thing called respiration. It's kind of the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis makes the food, makes the sugars. Respiration breaks those sugars down and uses them for growth in the tree. So as long we all respire, anything that's alive respires. So when you have photosynthesis that sometimes can be impacted by drought or flooding or soil compaction, reduces photosynthesis, the respiration is continuing. So at some point, if photosynthesis didn't return to the norm, that's when a tree starts declining and dying. So photosynthesis, that's the food in the leaf, or the food being made. Here's a cross section of the leaf. Bunch of stuff you don't need to know. But generally, the surface or the cuticle of the leaf is what protects it from desiccation. Here in Texas, where we have such extreme heat, a lot of times the cuticle of leaves is thick and waxy, more so than trees in other regions to help protect it from desiccation. And these things that look like blood vessels in there, that's the xylem and the phloem. And that's what the xylem transports water and nutrients up from the roots to the rest of the tree. The phloem transports food made in the leaves to the tree. So those are kind of the blood vessels. And then at the bottom, you see these things called guard cells or stoma. That's where all the, the gas and water exchange happens in a tree. It's called transpiration. Most of the water taken up by a tree goes right out through the leaves in transpiration. That cools the tree and also helps in gas exchange. So those little stoma, I'm sorry, I know this is horrible to listen to. Those little stomata have guard cells on them, and depending on climate or weather conditions, they swell shut or open up. If it's a spring day with moderate temperatures and lots of water, they're wide open and transpiration is happening, and that's when photosynthesis is really kicking in. In August, when it's hotter than heck and dry, those things tend to be shut so that the tree's not losing too much water. But they're very interesting little structures. So then there's another type of leaf here. I never heard this term until corresponding with Megan the other day. I always call it persistent. You got those trees where the leaves just stick on them all winter, and a lot of them are oak trees. Marcescent is the actual term. So we know what's going on. We just don't know why this happens. And it depends on something called an abscission layer. That's a little layer of cells that separates the base of the leaf, the petiole, the stem, from the twig of the plant. And sometimes these things don't break off like they normally do for deciduous trees, and you get those persistent leaves that are there all year long. And then finally, this is the last one. Something about fall color. Fall color is not, we don't usually get a heck of a lot of it in Texas. The yellow and orange pigments, they're called carotenoids, and they're there, they're there all year long. You just can't see them because of the chlorophyll, the greens cover them up. The red and the purples, though, the anthocyanins, they are formed later in the season when fall is coming on. And how bright they are depends on that abscission layer again. It's a matter of how much sugars get trapped in those leaves before that abscission layer forms. The more sugar that's trapped in there, the more reds and purple pigments you're going to see in fall color. And it all depends again on that abscission layer. And so up here, I'm in North Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth area. We had great fall color this year. And of course, we had drought and incredible heat all summer, like pretty much everybody else in Texas. And that's been a couple of years in a row. We've had good fall color with those conditions. So I'm guessing, I got no proof, that the drought makes the abscission layer form early. Maybe more sugars get trapped in there, so we have better fall colors, which sounds really weird when you got drought. But I'm just guessing on that. I don't know. So that's everything I know about leaves.
Outstanding. Thanks for that presentation, Courtney, and give you a few seconds to get a good drink of tea and get ready because we'll roll right into our second presentation with Courtney. If you have questions for our speakers, please remember to type them into the question and answer box. And as we go throughout the event, the speakers will be able to answer those questions. So, Courtney, to continue on the theme of evergreens, we're going to now ask you to discuss Texas oaks, and I'll send it back to you.
All right, let's see here. All right, so this little PowerPoint, I'm going to skip through a bunch of it. I did not make this PowerPoint, as you can see. My name is not Susan Sander. Apparently, she worked for us at one point, but she had a nice little show put together here about oaks and the hill country. So we've got a lot more oaks than just in the hill country, obviously, in Texas. Texas has a boatload of oaks. Texas has more oak species than any other state in the country. And the United States, I've read this at more than one place, I'm assuming it's true. The United States has more oak species than any other country in the world, but Texas, I think she's got a slide in here with some numbers on it, really has a lot of oak species. And several of them, or some of them, are endemic only to Texas. Like if you go out to Big Bend area, I don't know who else been to Big Bend. I'm going next week for Christmas break, yay. But there's some oaks out there that don't grow anywhere else in the world. And it's really interesting. I remember once there's an International Oak Society, and once they met in Dallas, they meet like every 3 years. And part of their conference is a tour. So my job with Forest Service, this was great. I spent a week driving these people around the state in a van looking at trees. And I got paid for that. But we went out to the Big Bend area where they had this Hinckley oak, which there's only like two little specimens of it known to exist in Big Bend Ranch State Park. And one of them was right by the road out in the middle of nowhere. So I pull over by this thing, and it was like the red carpet in Hollywood when people are flashing their cameras and taking pictures of all those stars coming in. That's what it was like with these people trying to get a picture of this little shrub that was an endemic oak. It was hilarious. But again, the point is we got a lot of oak trees here in Texas. So if you're going to try to identify trees, you need some sort of guide. Used to be it was books. Now we've got these great apps on our phone like iNaturalist or I think Snaps one. There's a bunch of them where you can take a picture of a leaf and it does a darn good job most of the time of at least getting you close to what it might be. Now, some of these oddball species of oak we have in Texas, they might not get it. But if you're going old school with a book, you really need something that's regionalized. It really helps. For instance, if you go out to West Texas, Trees of the Trans-Pecos, written by Dr. Powell, is really good for that region. But there isn't nothing in that book that's going to be over here in Dallas-Fort Worth, or not much. So you really need a regionalized guide because Texas is still really big. You can get a tree ID book, an oak ID book of Texas, and what's going on in Beaumont is totally different than what's going on in El Paso. So a regionalized guide helps. And these things will have keys in them. Most of them have keys, which is just something that helps you step-by-step process identify the specific tree you're looking at there. It goes on clues. It's there. A lot of them are called dichotomous keys, which means it's asking you two questions. Does the tree look like this, or does it look like that? And if it looks like this, it'll tell you go to number 3 or something. If it looks like that, it tells you go to number 5. And then it'll ask you two questions again. Does it look like this or that? And you keep going until you eventually hit a dead end and the name of a tree. That's a dichotomous key. But again, with the phone apps out there, it's a whole lot easier now than using these dichotomous keys. But depends if you're old like me, you like dichotomous keys. There's one from the National Arbor Day Foundation. And, it starts you off as a conifer, as a broadleaf, and it just keeps breaking down. The tree has needle-like leaves or scale-like leaves. If it has needle-like leaves, are they clustered in bundles? Or are they attached singly to the twig? On and on and on. And that'll eventually get you somewhere. So the main things you're looking for in oak or tree identification, you look at a lot of clues. You look at bark, for instance, but the main things is usually what type of leaf it is, how it's arranged on the tree, and even its margins, which is a minor thing. So what is the leaf? Well, there's a leaf. It has the blade up there that you see, and then it has that stem, which is called a petiole. So that's a simple leaf. That's one that just has one leaf blade. Where is the leaf? How it's arranged on the tree is also an important clue for identification for the oaks and everything else. There's only 3 ways a leaf will be on a tree, and I think there's pictures in here coming up. Opposite leaves, alternate leaves, or whorled leaves. These pictures here, this is what's called alternate arrangement. You can see that one on the left, you've got a leaf, you got one here, then on the other side it's up here, and they alternate on opposite sides of the twig, not directly opposite each other. That's alternate. The one on the left, those are individual leaves too, and I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this whole thing is a leaf, not each of these individual leaflets. The whole thing is a leaf. So that's a compound leaf, and it can fool you into thinking it's a bunch of individual leaves, and it's not. So how do you know where the leaf starts? You look for the bud. The base of the leaf should have a bud there. It tells you that's where it starts. Now, sometimes these buds are not easy to see. But again, the picture bottom left, that circle, that circle shows where the bud is. So everything out beyond that is the leaf. It's one leaf, even though it's got a bunch of separate leaflets. It's one leaf. That's a compound leaf. And then the top right picture is cedar elm. Those are simple leaves. It's just one leaf. But again, you're circling the bud. So look for the bud. When you find the bud, you know you found the start of the leaf. So again, that's simple leaf, compound leaf, pecans. There's a pecan right there, and that's got a compound leaf. A lot of little leaflets. Then there's different types of compound leaves. You got simple up there, but then you also have once compound or twice compound leaves, like a mimosa. So it can get kind of complicated sometimes figuring out what is the leaf of the thing. But again, there's simple leaf, one leaf blade, and there's examples of compound leaves. Each of those, the entire thing is one leaf, not the individual leaflets. So we talked again about leaf arrangement, the simple alternate arrangement or opposite or whorled. You can see in that picture there, the top right pictures can help you in identifying the species of tree. And oaks too. I know I'm not talking about oaks much yet. I'm getting there. If you have a tree with opposite branching, so these pictures show leaves on a tree that are coming out exactly opposite each other. That's called opposite branching. If you find a tree, you walk up a tree with opposite branching, it really narrows down what it can be. There's acronyms like this bottom left you can do to help you remember what they are. This one's, I've never heard this one before, but it's similar to what I use, MAD, buck, or whatever. But MAD stands for maples, ashes, dogwoods, and then these other strange species that most of them aren't even big trees. But maples, ashes, and dogwoods all have opposite branching. So if you walk up to a tree and it's got opposite branching, and it's native, not something from China planted in arboretum, even though that would still apply, it's likely to be a maple, ash, or dogwood. So you really narrow down your choices real good then. If it's alternate, like these pictures here, the leaf coming out over here, then over there, alternates back and forth, man, 98% of the trees we got are alternates. So that don't help you at all. So, and again, whorled. The only tree I know with whorled leaves is a catalpa. So they're even less common. So if you got opposite of whorled, it really helps you in identifying the things. And then we look at the margins sometimes, not very often. Usually by the time you get there, you've already figured out what the heck it is, but there's different margins, serrated or whatever. So onto the leaves, I say opposite branching, I mean the oaks, opposite branching really helps you narrow down what something can be. And of course, the oaks do not have opposite branching. They're simple leaves, they're not compound. And as I said, there's a ton of oaks in the state of Texas. Now, her numbers don't match up here on the white oaks and red oaks, but compared with what's in the upper line, 58 species of oaks in the U.S., 43 of those are in Texas. So again, we got a lot of these things. The oaks are broken up basically into two main groups, the white oaks and the red oaks. And then there's the live oaks, which are the weird one that's kind of, who knows which one it's in. The white oaks, these things are called lobes. These little fingers or arms, and these are called sinuses. The white oaks have rounded lobes. The red oaks have a pointed lobe, like the vein actually extends out the tip. So it's a bristle tip. That's the difference between red oaks and white oaks. Red oaks are much more susceptible to oak wilt, which is our major disease on trees here in Texas. But white oaks can get it too. One particular white oak is it's not immune, it's resistant, highly resistant. That's post oak, which luckily up in my area, we got the cross timbers forest, which is predominantly post oak. It would be a mess if oak wilt was bad on those. So the hill country oaks, again, there's a lot there. And there's a lot that aren't on this presentation that happen in East Texas and West Texas, all over the state. One of the more common ones, you get this term of a shin oak a lot of times, or a scrub oak. That's generally a term given to any tree or any oak tree that spends a lot of its life cycle as a bush. These Havard shin oaks is what I call this. It's not white shin oak up here, but it's the same thing. and it's a variety of Durand oak, and it goes up to like Abilene, Stephenville, and then down into the hill country. This is just a really small tree. So if you don't have a lot of space, you want an oak. This white shin oak's a real good option. Most of the white oaks have this kind of bark where it's almost gray looking and kind of flat plates instead of real deep fissures and grooves in there. That's typical of most of the white oaks. And this is a really hardy, drought hardy tree in here. Lacy oak, real common in the hill country. Love this tree. It's another one that's not going to get real big, but this blue-green foliage on the leaves is really, really unique looking. And again, most of the time it has kind of the light-colored bark that's a little flaky. But it's a really pretty tree, and it's not going to get real big. Bur oak has a range that goes from Texas to Montana up into the Northeast. This may be the broadest range of any oak tree we've got, and it's pretty easy to identify bur oak by the acorns. They're about the size of golf balls, and they've got these caps you can see there that cover up a lot of it and have this little frilly hair-like things on the edge of the cap. So bur oak's pretty easy. These things will get massive, by the way. And I'm not sure you'd want it in your yard because of those acorns. And then chinkapin oak, this is native to pretty much all of Texas that has trees, west to east. And I hardly ever see this in commercial nurseries for sale. And I don't understand why. They can handle high pH, they can handle low pH. That picture of the leaf is not really typical. Usually the underside is kind of gray or whitish color, so they really look cool when the wind's blowing in those leaves. You can see the colors on there. I don't know why chinkapin's not sold more in stores. The Mexican white oak or Monterey oak, that's something that's, if it's native to Texas, it's just right down there on the border. It's as the name implies, mostly from Mexico. I love this tree too. There's some planted up here in the Metroplex, and I always thought it's going to be way too cold for them. But it's not. We had the big freeze, a couple of years ago, 2021. None of the Monterey or Mexican white oaks seem to have suffered. I mean, there's not a lot of them planted, but the ones I've seen, nothing happened with them. So it's a great tree to plant too. And they're pretty easy to find. Then our live oak. In the hill country, we've got escarpment live oak. The live oak you see in Houston is a different species. And that kind of drives me nuts because they look exactly alike. I mean, I teach a tree ID class every fall at Tarrant County College. I have given up trying to tell these two species apart. They look just alike. But that's the tree that's kind of, if pecan wasn't our state tree, I would think live oak is, because it's just a beautiful tree. It's tough as nails, and really it can fit into any place. I mean, it can grow in solid rock. I've seen it, but it's such a majestic tree, as you can see in these pictures here. So, post oak, post oaks grow on low pH soils or neutral pH soils. So, if you see a post oak, you're probably seeing a sandstone-based soil, not like a lot of white caliche rock and things like that. So, it's an indicator species. And then post oak usually grows in conjunction with blackjack oak, so people can get them mixed up. But the post oak is a white oak, and the blackjack oak is a red oak. So the blackjack oak has these bristle tips coming out. The post oak is rounded. Also, the bark, blackjack, the bark is usually much blacker on a blackjack oak than on a post oak. But anyway, oaks are pretty unique here in Texas, and one of our great assets.
Thank you, Courtney. That was really great. I'm sorry to make you suffer through with your voice, but it was fantastic. I enjoyed that presentation. I'll turn it over to you, Tim.
All right. Thanks, Megan. So next up, we have Brian Townsend. He's going to speak on our East Texas pines, and Brian is the USDA Natural Resource and Conservation Service State Forester for Texas with a regular duty station in Nacogdoches. Previously, he worked as timber manager for the National Forest and Grasslands in Texas, and has also worked as a U.S. Forest Service Southern Region Tribal Relations Manager in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior work for Brian also includes the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Rocky Mountain region in Billings, Montana, as a regional timber sales forester, as well as state, private, and municipal work as a forester, natural resource manager, and as a certified arborist. Brian is also a veteran of the U.S. Army and a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. His interests include ecosystem restoration, agricultural interests, tribal interests, and playing music. He has a small ranch near Grapeland, Texas, where he has cattle, poultry, and works at small scale farming. Welcome to Plant Party, Brian, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. We're going to look at some common mutual areas of these of the three pines. And the three pines I really want to key in on are very, very important to Texas. That's the longleaf pine, shortleaf pine, and of course, loblolly pine. This is the shortleaf pine range, and you can see in East Texas extends throughout East Texas here. And it is the largest ranging pine actually in the nation, somewhere in the neighborhood of 440,000 square miles throughout the United States. This next slide shows in the brown there, this is the common shared area of the loblolly pine range. And the shortleaf, of course, extends around it, but loblolly is kind of focused in the brown, so that they coexist together. And actually, through this next slide, you'll see that the longleaf pine, I'm using our longleaf pine initiative map, extends through there, but is less extensive than either shortleaf or probably loblolly. Here in Texas, most of our pines are going to be on the right side here in the area, number one area here, with the odd exception of Bastrop, which has loblolly pines located around here. Here's a historic range map, kind of from the the eastern half of Texas. We've got the longleaf pine, the loblolly here, shortleaf pine, natural. These are natural ranges. Then we go into post oaks and prairies. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cones and identification here. The longleaf pine, of course, has the largest cones. And if you've ever been in a longleaf pine forest and had one conky on the head, you'll remember it. It's a pretty large pine cone. We have slash pine here, which isn't native to Texas, but has been introduced here and used commercially in industrial pine plantations. Of course, this is a loblolly pine, and shortleaf pine has very small cones, and you can kind of see them. They're kind of attached right to. They've got a little stem here and right to the branch. And here's some the longleaf cones are, like I said, 2 to 6 inches. The longleaf or loblolly is 2 to 6 inches. Longleaf cones are 6 to 10 inches. And the most notable about longleaf is the length of their pine needles, and it's virtually unmistakable. They're very long. They can go 3 to 8 to 18 inches long, and they're of high use for historically and culturally throughout the South. I'll talk a little bit about the shortleaf pine. Is a native of North America and is the most widespread pine tree in America. It encompasses 22 states, about 440,000 square miles. I think we said 80 to 100 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Shortleaf occurs in a wide variety of habitats. It is highly desired. It's very heavy wood. It's desired commercially and ecologically. The shortleaf pine forests were very diverse in biodiversity. Currently, unfortunately, it occurs on less than 10% of its historic range. Similar to longleaf pine, shortleaf pine has fire-adapted traits and is dependent on frequent fire for regeneration and maintaining structure and composition of the shortleaf ecosystem. One of the fire-adapted traits that I think is pretty neat about shortleaf, if you look at the ceiling here, you can kind of see what's called a basal crook, and there's a bud right here is ready to go as soon if it gets top killed by fire. It can resprout. One of the few resprouting pines that I'm aware of. This is a typical picture of a shortleaf pine stand that has frequent fire. You can see a little char on the sides, and it really needs this to open us up, and it may be hard, and this is always hard to articulate because our forests are so dense now, but this is probably typical of what we'd see in a shortleaf stand, say 300-400 years ago. Most of our stands that were very savanna-like. In Texas, this northeastern part here is primarily where most of our shortleaf stands did occur. Here's a stand with a herbaceous understory, extreme species richness here, great habitat, fire adapted, fire dependent. This is a mixed loblolly shortleaf stand that has not seen fire in a while, and it is very unnatural, and it probably needs fire reintroduced into the stand. I will go to one of my favorites, longleaf pine. Is a native of North America and can reach a height of 120 feet and 2.5 feet in diameter. This is the longest lived pine in the South. Generally 250 years, but there's been species found or individuals found that are up to 400 years old. It's usually found on sandy, infertile, or well-drained soils. It's a much narrower range, but it stretches into East Texas. This is a highly sought after and commercially important species that was utilized heavily in the turn of the century. It was a major producer for turpentine and kerosene and naval stores supplies. It grows extremely straight, so many of the telephone poles that you drive by are probably going to be longleaf pine. This is the kind of the range of where the natural occurrence of longleaf pine extended. There were different types of stands. My agency, the NRCS, has a initiative program within these counties to help restore the longleaf pine stands. They have a very unique, in fact, the longleaf pine ecosystem is probably second to only the tropical forest in species richness and diversity. This is a typical longleaf savanna stand, and like shortleaf, is very, very dependent on frequent fires to maintain this. This is kind of a grass or herbaceous understory, which is very well sought after for habitat. In other cases, this is a longleaf coastal flatwood, fairly dense. This is an old stand. I hadn't seen fire for a little bit, but typically that's what maintained it for decades. This is kind of the reproduction strategy for longleaf. You can see that a new cohort of longleaf stems are coming in, and this is beginning to develop into what we would have saw 300-400 years ago, probably just multi-aged, mixed-aged stands that are savanna-like. I'll go into the loblolly pine. It is considered the leading commercial timber species in the southern United States because of its wide range and adaptability to a variety of sites. It can grow up to 100 feet tall as well, and 2.5 feet in diameter. But it is a very prolific cedar. Loblolly is widely viewed as easier to establish than longleaf or shortleaf pines as well, and is a faster growing species initially. Compared to, I'm going to flip back, compared to longleaf, you can see this little sapling right here is just beginning its rocket stage. And the unique thing about longleaf is that it will stay as kind of a little bush right in the grass. That's called the grass stage for 1 to 5 years. And that's why folks prefer in replacing these stands with loblolly. They could see the results of, a year or two after planting of the loblolly growing up, but actually the longleaf strategy is built around fire. So it would stay in this grass stage. It was growing, but it was growing down deep because it usually inhabited the droughtier soils. And then after a couple of years, it had the strategy to grow straight up, just like this, so it could survive these frequent fires. And this is called the rocket stage, if you can follow me on that. And it was extremely dependent on fire. So it wasn't really growing less than the other species. It was growing down and establishing its roots, the engine system of the tree, if you will. And so as a result, longleaf basically can handle drought much easier, handle fire much easier. Now, no trees are fireproof that I'm aware of, but longleaf and shortleaf are easily more fire dependent and actually resistant. Now, you may have loblolly, and folks have loblolly. Once it gets up to size, 6-7 inches, you can do broadcast burning on it. This is a loblolly stand, frequently burned stand, and it has much of the characteristics of the typical savanna ecosystems of shortleaf and longleaf. This is an old loblolly plantation. Unfortunately, we see a lot of this. And as you can see, the understory is getting less and less diverse and getting tough. It's losing its habitat value because of the lack of fire. And I got to associate everything with fire because the fire history, and if you look here in Texas, and that's kind of hard to see, I apologize for that, but this is like 1 to 2 years, this dark red here. This is 2 to 4 years just outside of that, and so on. So fire is a very, very big part of the maintenance and the adaptation of our species of forest here in the South. And since we have suppressed fire for so many years, we're seeing a big change in our forests here in Texas, a big time change. And it's losing some of its resiliency. It's changing species. Shade intolerant species are starting to dominate. The ecosystems of the shortleaf, longleaf, and even the loblolly that existed here was adapted to frequent fire, so never really reached its zenith or climax. Looks of the forest because of the frequent fires. So if you take anything away from this point or from this presentation from me, when looking at picking species to plant, pick species suited for the property that you own. Different tree species survive longer and have fewer insect disease problems when planted on the right site. So work with Mother Nature, not against her. Don't try to bring in things that really aren't well adapted. Recommend diversity of species to maximize wildlife benefit and decrease risks of death or diseases. These are just kind of fundamentals that I advise folks. Active management is necessary. Trees need thinning to stay healthy, but thinning varies, commercial versus non-commercial, mechanical, herbicide. The forests were never stagnant. They're stagnant or they're never static, excuse me. They're always growing. It's just a slower time span than what you might be looking for or used to in a garden, if you will. Consider prescribed fire as a management tool, but it may not be right for everyone. And regardless of who you go for assistance, make sure to develop a management plan. That is kind of your living a guideline when managing forests. And thank you very much, Megan.
All right. Thanks very much, Brian, for that presentation. Next up, we have Elizabeth McGreevy with Project Bedrock, who will speak on junipers of Texas. Elizabeth is a nonprofit and private sector professional, natural resources and ecological consultant with more than 25 years of expertise in hill country working lands and ecosystem analysis, planning, education, project management, and best development practices. Her well-researched book, Wanted: Mountain Cedars, Dead and Alive, advances many of the nature-based solutions that serve as the basis for the Project Bedrock mission. A sixth-generation Texan, Elizabeth received her master's degree from Texas A&M and is a certified permaculture planner. Welcome to Plant Party, Elizabeth. I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so when Megan approached me to ask me to do a presentation on the junipers of Texas, I had to tell her that I'm more an expert on the limestone junipers of Texas. However, I am familiar with the rest of the junipers in Texas just from writing my book, because I wanted to clarify, explain how they're different from other junipers. If you really want to get in-depth knowledge about junipers, Dr. Robert Adams he passed away about 2 years ago, but he was the world authority on junipers. So that's a really good book to get. So quick botanical classification. They're, of course, in the kingdom of plants, conifers, and then the family is Cupressaceae, and then the genus, of course, is Juniperus. So, and a lot of people will call these cedar trees. The reason is because, like the true cedars that occur in like Europe and kind of a little bit over into Asia, the true cedars share the same cedral oil with the juniper, so they kind of smell the same, and that's why it has become such a common name, is to call them cedars. And like was previously discussed, the junipers have both needle-like leaves and scale-like leaves. Junipers, the common juniper that occurs in Europe and has been widely used for gin making, I think that one just has the needle-like leaves, if I'm correct. But most of all the junipers here in Texas have the scale-like overlapping leaves. However, when they're juveniles and when new growth comes out, that will be more needle-like. I think it's just to protect it from browsing. This little botanical specimen in the middle there was collected. That's an ash juniper collected in like about 18. It was collected by Frederick Law Olmsted in the mid 1800s. So that's kind of a neat little thing. Juniper berries are actually fleshy cones. They're not like an apple, as was previously put out, that they're not in an ovary. And you can see the middle picture there. You can see the little tiny little cone, little pieces still sticking out. So it kind of starts off as a soft cone and turns into a thing that looks like a fruit. Excuse me, I have a little bit of frog in my throat too. But they're actually just fleshy cones, and they come in shades of blue or shades of red. And they ripen the following fall and winter after pollination occurs. And the fruits serve as an important source of wintertime carbs for Texas wildlife, whereas you have all the mast, that provides protein and fats and stuff. Well, these provide the carbs. One thing that's interesting with junipers is that they do the twist, and different people you don't really see this as much in your junipers that are growing in the more mesic areas, more humid areas. These, the drier the conditions, the more they twist, and it appears to be partly a drought response, but also a lot of times these areas tend to be really windy, and it could even be a way to kind of strengthen the trunk so it's stronger. And we are going to group the junipers in Texas. So we have 9 species. We're going to group them by seeds. You have the multi-seed junipers, and these occur where it's more mesic. It's not as dry. And then on the right-hand side, you have the one-seed junipers that occur where it's a lot drier and more arid. And in order, okay, so eastern red cedar is that kind of pale olive. that is your East Texas, grows along with all the pine trees, and that extends all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, is the most common juniper in the United States. The Rocky Mountain juniper is not as common in Texas. You can see it up there in the Panhandle and the Trans-Pecos, just a few spots in here and there, a little bit higher elevation. The alligator juniper occurs just in the Trans-Pecos. There's a whole lot of them on the Davis Mountains. Like if you go to the McDonald Observatory, there's a whole lot there. The drooping juniper, also called the weeping juniper, you see that little bright green spot down in where Big Bend National Park is, just a little spot of it, small population, but they're a lot more common in Mexico. Excuse me. The one seed juniper, so we're moving over to the right-hand side, starts off with the one-seeded juniper, which clearly has one seed, and that is that pale mint color, again, Panhandle, Trans-Pecos. The red-berry juniper is that tan color. You have a lot of that on the western Edwards Plateau. Like if you go to Palo Duro Canyon, most of those are going to be red-berry junipers, and then they're just kind of mixed in the Trans-Pecos. The rose-fruited juniper is very closely related to the red-berry juniper, but it seems to occur a little bit higher elevations, and so you're only going to find that in the Trans-Pecos. The ash juniper is very abundant on the eastern Edwards Plateau, and see how it moves up northward to the Red River. It's basically following limestone. And so it's definitely a juniper that prefers limestone as opposed to your sandy loams and your clays. The Adams juniper you may not have heard about because it's only been recently identified through DNA analysis. And that is kind of like that darker magenta color, that kind of purple color. And there's a population that grows around New Braunfels and in the western Edwards Plateau, but about 10,000 years ago, its range would have been a lot more extensive. Okay, hold on. So now we're going to just go tree by tree. The eastern red cedar, and on each of these slides at the top, right under the main name, I put there the genus and species. And so eastern red cedar has blue fruits, and it pollinates between February and April. There is a subspecies. For a while, people thought it was a different one, but it's really been considered to be a subspecies, and that is the coastal red cedar. And it's just as eastern red cedar that grows along the coast and seems to have a preference for a little bit wetter soils. Basically, this is your Christmas tree juniper. And I just want to make a note here. This is the only younger version of a juniper I'm going to show in this presentation because I wanted to focus on what they look like when they're older. Because right now in Texas, we have a overabundance of the very young bushy kind of junipers because most of them were cut down in the like 1800s through the mid 1900s. So the picture on the right shows what an older heartwood eastern red cedar would look like if it's growing among the pine trees and all that. On the left is the bushy one. It has become quite a problem in Oklahoma and other areas where it is spreading beyond its natural occurrence. The Rocky Mountain juniper, this picture is fantastic. You see a lot of pictures of the Rocky Mountain junipers. Photographers love to take pictures of them. They're very twisted and tortured looking, and they definitely occur in very open woodlands. They have blue fruits also and pollinate April through May. One of my favorites is the alligator juniper. Like I said, that is most abundant in Texas in the Davis Mountains. And look at the bark there. I hope you can see it unless you're on the phone, maybe zoom into the picture. The bark looks like alligator skin. So it's a very, very easy juniper to identify. Again, blue fruits, and it pollinates February to March. The drooping juniper. So this is the one that we only just have a few of in Big Bend, but it is so neat looking that a arboretum in England got a species. So that picture of a full-grown one is in England. It's really, really neat. It makes a really neat specimen tree. So you can see that I did show zoom in of these leaves just to show that they are literally drooping. And so these also have blue fruits, pollinate February through April. So as you can see, the trend here is that they mostly pollinate kind of like late fall to late winter. And then the fruits ripen the following fall and winter. One seed juniper. Okay, now we're back into the one seed junipers. And can you see the immediate chain? Wait, sorry, I was going the wrong way. Trying to figure out how to go backwards. Oh, no, sorry. So you go from these, like this one especially, to here, immediately just kind of showcases that these are definitely more xeric, that these trees can handle much drier conditions. These have blue fruits. They pollinate a little bit later, April through May. So it's more like into spring. Very, very cool looking tree. And this is still live, even though about half of it is has stopped growing. Redberry juniper is the same way. Now, if you look, this is at Palo Duro Canyon. If you look down there at the bottom in the distance, you can see how they're growing as your standard little bush that we're all used to seeing everywhere. But historically, they would grow more like this one in the foreground. Much older, like that one there is going to be several hundred years old. And one problem with this is that it does cover a lot of area in Texas, is that if you do cut it down, it does resprout, much to the behoovement of many land managers. The rose-fruited juniper, like I said, is very similar to the redberry juniper. And it has red fruits that pollinate October to November. So you can see that they pollinate at the same time. But it has been clearly determined to be a different species now. This one does seem to develop more of a trunk habit even when it's younger. Okay, so here we are, ash juniper. And this is also one seed juniper. That picture is, that's me standing next to the largest one that I found. It's in Buda at a cemetery. In fact, if you ever want to find big junipers, go check out all the cemeteries around you, because it is considered to be evergreen. They were often prized for cemeteries because the evergreen nature of them symbolizes everlasting life. However, one thing about evergreen, like conifers, especially junipers, is that even though they have the appearance of never dropping all their leaves, they do continuously shed the leaves. So all year long, they are shedding and contributing to the soil organic matter. And most of the shedding does for most of them happens in the fall, but it never is to the point where they're bare. It's just a consistent shedding as opposed to all at once. Juniperus ashii tends to be a multi-trunk, a bush to a multi-trunk tree. I guess here you could almost call it a tree because it has a tiny bit of a trunk, but you can see how it definitely, doesn't have a standard well-defined trunk kind of tree form. It has blue fruits that pollinate December to February, and seeds are average about one seed. And you'll see in the next slide why I point that out. They, like I said before, they have a preference for limestone bedrock with shallow soils, and that's called karst country. The biggest karst country in Texas would be the Edwards Plateau. Okay, so here's the confusing part. This is the new juniper that has been recently identified as being different. It also occurs on the Edwards Plateau, overlaps with a lot of the ash juniper range. One thing is that it's not classified as a multi-seed juniper, but it averages more often on 2 seeds versus the ash juniper averages more on 1 seed. Also, the tree, this juniper definitely forms more of a tree form, as you can see from the pictures here. It has blue fruits. They pollinate around the same time as ash juniper. It also has a preference for limestone bedrock and shallow soils. And they can get really large. The state champion, Juniperus ovata, which currently is classified as a Juniperus ashii, but it's actually an ovata, has a 44-inch wide trunk, which makes it at least 450 years old. So how do you know if it's ash or Adams? Because they do overlap so much in the range. Well, you need a magnifying glass, a pretty good strong magnifying glass. If it's ash juniper, and this is what you find in springtime, are these little whipleaf glands that kind of come off of the leaves when they're growing out new leaves, and they're like these like little spears. So that stretches out and exposes the whipleaf gland, and that is what the arrows are pointing to. You can see on the ash juniper how the glands are very like a circle. Now look here on the Adams on the right and see how they're clearly oval shape. So that's why it's called Juniperus ovata, for oval. And I call it Adams. That's what I've been calling it, just because Dr. Robert Adams, the one I mentioned at the beginning, who is the world expert on junipers, he was the one who identified this. Now comes the even more confusing part, is that for years people kept saying, you know, while I was doing my research on the junipers that grow on limestone karst country, people kept approaching me saying, there's more than one juniper. Well, okay, there is the ovata, but it only occurs in a few spots, and it's more of an ancestral remnant. But Dr. Adams, after I talked to him a lot, they did some more studies, and they've come out and they realized that yes, ash juniper and the Adams juniper, they do hybridize. And remember I showed before when they pollinate, well, they pollinate at the same time. So that is a big thing right there. They have to pollinate at the same time in order to hybridize. And a lot of people said, no, they're hybridizing with Eastern red cedar. Well, Eastern red cedar doesn't really pollinate at the same time. And Dr. Adams did go through both red-berried juniper and Eastern red cedar, found that both them had deviated too much on that evolutionary scale to make it so they can hybridize. He found no signs of hybridizing there, but yes, he did find that the ashii and Adams. Anyway, this does get more complicated, but it also means that if we're doing land management, is my theory historically that we had more ovata and more hybrids and less of the pure ash juniper. That when doing land management, perhaps we should be focusing on retaining more of these hybrids and the ovata as opposed to the pure ash juniper. I think that the pure ash juniper was, because it is a bush that occurred like along edges and things like that. And it, like the hybrids, like the ovata, are also more tree-like. I mean, very tree-like. Also have a very well-defined trunk. That's me on the left there, standing next to one that has a 31-inch diameter trunk, and also just out in the full sun. You know, it's like a lot of pure ash junipers just form a bush out in full sun, but this one is a well-defined trunk, and it's looks like an oak tree. You know, it grows those branches down low to keep the grasses from growing from underneath, because we have short trees in the karst country, so we don't want a lot of fire moving underneath them. So how do you know if it's a hybrid or an Eastern red cedar? Because there are places where Eastern red cedar do overlap with both the hybrid ash junipers and ovata, and the best way is that you have to pull out a little microscope. Now, who was it who was talking earlier about the oaks? He said we don't look at leaf margins a lot. Well, when it comes to junipers, you have to look at them. This is the only way to know 100% without getting into a DNA study that's Eastern red cedar versus ash Adams hybrid or ash juniper or just Adams juniper. All the ash Adams hybrid, the Adams juniper, and the ash juniper all had the little tiny serrated leaf. Do you see like the little tiny, the arrows pointing at, like the little tiny little teeth along the edge there? Eastern red cedar is very smooth, it's entire. But because their little tiny leaflets are so small, you have to get a look at under a tiny microscope, not a high powered microscope, just something about 200 times something. So anyway, if you have questions, let me know. This was a lot to take in, especially once you get into the more complicated, hybrids and all that. But it's definitely something that I think is important to talk about, because people are going into the Central Texas region and just calling everything a damn cedar. And I think that being able to differentiate the different habits and is important to improve how we manage this area.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was an excellent presentation. Our final speaker, Tim Sigmund, you already know as a Plant Party host. Tim is the private lands program leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. He was born and raised in Giddings, Texas, and completed a bachelor's degree in graduate research at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas, followed by employment with Texas Parks and Wildlife in 2009. In College Station, Tim was responsible for 7 counties performing wildlife surveys, public outreach, technical guidance, and prescribed fire assistance, public hunting opportunities, wildlife tax valuation planning, and dealing with other wildlife issues. But starting in 2017, Tim began his role as a private lands program leader for Parks and Wildlife, dealing with private land issues in a statewide capacity. Tim resides in College Station with his wife and 3 children. Today, Tim's going to share with us about magnificent magnolias. Tim, take it away.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for attending today and sitting through all these talks. It's been very interesting. Hopefully, I follow suit and able to engage everybody with this group of trees. So a lot of you, especially those in Southeast Texas, are probably very familiar with magnolia trees, particularly the southern magnolia, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But there's really an interesting evolutionary history here from a very diverse and old group of plants. So let's get into it. So magnolias are truly an ancient genus of plants. They evolved prior to the appearance of bees. And so they have an interesting strategy to get fertilized and to create seeds. And their fossil record as a genus goes back 90 million years into the Cretaceous period. So there were members of the Magnolia genus around when there were still dinosaurs prior to the giant extinction event. So Magnolia acuminata, which is a very common magnolia species that does not occur in Texas, but occurs in most of the rest of its range into the Northeast, has a fossil record going all the way back 20 million years, and it still exists. So what you see in that range map that I have there from the Botanical Plant Atlas of North America is basically showing the distribution of all the native magnolias within the eastern United States. You can see we're kind of on the very southwest distribution of where those species occur. So this species, because it evolved before there were bees and butterflies and moths and those sorts of things, it has some of the earliest evidence of the coevolution of flowering plant species and insect pollination. And so it did that with beetles. And so beetles are the primary pollinator for these magnolia trees. And so the first species we're going to talk about, there's 2 that are fairly widely distributed across the southeastern U.S. and that occur in Texas. There's a handful of others with just a few occurrences in Texas for maybe 1 or 2 counties or 1 or 2 site locations. But we're really just going to focus on 2 with the most widespread distribution. And the first of those is Magnolia grandiflora. So that's the true southern magnolia. Some call them bull magnolias or bully magnolias. This is the one that you see mostly in folks' yards. It can be a very large evergreen tree. So it's got those large elliptical leathery leaves that are shed mostly in the spring. But if you have one in your front yard, you know they can drop throughout the year and create quite a carpet of downed vegetation underneath them. The main reason folks like these is they are semi-evergreen. They do shed leaves, but for the most part, they have green leaves on them year-round. But it has these very large dinner plate-sized white to cream-colored flowers that are pollinated by beetles, as we mentioned. And because they're pollinated by beetles, what you'll find is these flowers are usually very tough. It takes a very hard rainstorm or windstorm to knock them off. They persist for a couple of weeks on the plants. And it's because when you look at bees, butterflies, and moths, they all have very soft mouth parts, kind of fuzzy bodies, those sorts of things, soft bodies. Beetles, on the other hand, are hard, can have very strong mouth parts and so on. And so these plants evolve the ability to be able to withstand that sort of munching that beetles might do to the plant itself or to the reproductive structures of the flower, and still be able to produce seed. So this plant is extremely important in the nursery trade. You can go across the southeastern US, and these are very popular in urban areas. They stand up well to soil compaction in certain places, to can be excessive water but not flooding. They can even deal with some decreased air quality compared to other tree species. And then, of course, those very large white flowers, which smell pretty good too. There are over 100 named varieties and cultivars of the southern magnolia available. Most of them are dwarf or compact varieties. Others are favored for the abilities of their flowers to have different morphological characteristics. But this is a very common and widespread tree. In areas that don't freeze, it's even found outside of its natural range. But if you follow it across the southeast, you can see if you follow a line of I-20 as it goes from Dallas east, it basically goes along that line there, kind of south of I-20, where it persists naturally in the forest. So if you were in a landscape situation, you might see some of these very large open grown situations. It can be 80 to 120 feet tall, 60 to 80 feet across. And in May, June, it can just be absolutely covered in those big blooms. So you can see how various stages of it in bloom, some yet to open, some fully open, some cones beginning to form, what serve as cones here. So its ornamental use is mainly because it's mostly disease-free. For a species that's been around for so long, it has very few pathological issues that cause it problems in an urban or in a landscape setting. It grows very well in areas that have at least 210 frost-free days, and they've actually increased its ability to be cold tolerant. There's a couple of varieties that are tolerant down to 0 or at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's most commonly found growing naturally where you have at least 250 frost-free days. So roughly 3 months or less of potential frost-free, 3 months or less where frost could be an issue. So these plants are found in almost every nursery across the southeastern portion of Texas, available for purchase. Its ability to flower and then also have interesting fruits at the end of that. You can see here's an example of that. It's not a true cone like other gymnosperms could be, but it's actually a collection of follicles that are in a cone shape with these seeds exuding. And those seeds can be picked up by birds and other species of wildlife for use. So where do magnolias occur in the natural environment? This is a picture from my friend Matt Buckingham, who works for TxDOT, excellent photographer, but they're mostly in rich wood sites. So this is an example from East Texas. I believe this is in Sabine County, near the Texas-Louisiana border, but this is a beech magnolia forest. So this is mostly going to be the bottom third of sandy slopes where you could have a higher availability of water as it seeps down through those sandy soils towards spring-fed creeks and those sorts of things. They're generally going to be very high in organic matter. You can see the amount of leaf litter there, but they are well drained. So these areas don't typically flood for long periods. Water is mostly available throughout the year. They're mostly going to be grown in the 42 to 55-inch rainfall zones in our states, even more the further east you go. They're not exactly tolerant of fire. If you look at those boles, those trunks, you can see it's that gray, thin bark. These areas, because they're damp, typically don't burn very often. And if they burn intensely, it could lead to a mortality event for a magnolia. They're not as fire tolerant as some of our oak and pine species further up topographically on the ridgetops, sandy ridgetops of these systems, and more the pine-dominated forests. And so it's a tree of rich woods. Those beech magnolia forests are a very common area that they're found. You're going to find a lot of other mesic species there. So those are ones that like moisture to be available, not too dry, not too wet. Trilliums, a whole bunch of other things that grow there. They can grow very tall in these locations. So other types of trees and plant community associations you might find in the forest canopy, cherry bark oaks, loblolly pines. Brian did a great job showing where those occurred earlier, kind of in line with these magnolia forests. Public lands where you can find some wild magnolias growing across the landscape would be in the Sabine, Angelina, even a little bit in the Sam Houston National Forest, but especially in the Big Thicket National Preserves, you'll find that. So think moist, but not flooded. The bottom third of those sandy hills along those perennial spring-fed creeks is really where you're going to find them. And you can kind of see that distribution there across the southeastern U.S., kind of like I said, just below that I-20 line as you get over there towards Atlanta, Charleston, South Carolina, all sort of that area over there. As you move down the slope, you've got a better example of what we call Baygall forest, and it's named that for the other species of magnolia we have, Magnolia virginiana, which is sweet bay. And so sweet bay is a little more flood tolerant. And so when you look at sweet bay magnolia, you can see it goes a little further north. This one's more of a semi-evergreen, so it does lose its leaves for a limited portion of the winter, but puts them on again pretty quickly. It's not as spreading or generally as large as its sibling, the southern magnolia, and it has its own forest type named after it, which is that Baygall forest. And this was the type specimen for the description of the genus Magnolia. So it'll always be a magnolia because this is the one that helped label the species. So Baygall forests, if you've never heard the name, which are widely distributed across southeastern U.S., are shrub wetland forests associated with swamps, floodplains, hillside seeps, and bogs where high levels of saturation occur. So this will usually be slightly acidic waters, depressions, those types of things where water can accumulate for periods of time. They're usually safe from fire given the high levels of moisture. And because of that high moisture content, there's usually a thick canopy of trees above that and a rich organic material below because fire can't get in there. And you'll have ferns, some wetland plants. You could have orchids and even carnivorous plants in these locations. There's even an entire unit in Southeast Texas of the Big Thicket National Preserve named for this forest type called the Jack Gore Baygall unit. And so one way to differentiate these sweet bays from southern magnolia is the leaves generally going to be a little more narrow at the top and at the base, at its apex and at the base. And then the undersides are generally white. If you notice that white glaucous coloration there, if you go to the next photo here showing the southern magnolia, you'll notice a much more elliptical, broader base at both where it connects to the twig, to the tree itself, and at the end. And then the underside is generally more of a russet, rust, or brown coloration than what you see on the sweet bay. And so when I used to work in East Texas and was going to school over there at Stephen F. Austin, if I was down in Southeast Texas, you could see the sweet bays from a distance away and know right away that you were probably going into a very wet area or a place where the water table was very high just by seeing those white undersides on a magnolia-looking tree in the distance, particularly during wintertime. The other difference you notice is in the fruiting body. So this is a sweet bay cone. It's usually going to be a little smaller and not as robust as a southern magnolia. So you can see on the left, you have Magnolia virginiana, the sweet bay, and on the right, you have the Magnolia grandiflora. So the flowers are typically a little larger on the southern magnolia. You're going to have a larger collection of follicles in that cone-like structure that's producing more seeds. And they kind of grow in just slightly different environments. So the sweet bay, more tolerant of flooding, and then the southern magnolia, less tolerant of flooding, but both liking have available moisture near them in those forest types. So here's an example of what the understory may look like in one of those baygalls. So lots of ferns growing there. You can see many different species of tree. So there's lots of co-associates here with those sweet bays as they grow. So you can also find things like red maple, swamp tupelo, green ash, things that are very tolerant of periodic flooding. If you look at that picture on the right from the National Park Service, you see that black line on the trees. That's the high water mark. So, it's almost at that gentleman's head level there, how high that water can get and persist for periods of time. You can imagine if there's 5 to 6 feet of flooding, the water is going to stick around for a while. But sweet gum and laurel oaks are other co-associates with that forest type. And then in the understory, you could have some shrubs such as Virginia sweet spire, swamp red bay. If you ever use bay leaves in your cooking to kind of simmer and thicken some of your stews and things like that, or gumbos, you can use red bay as some of the bay leaves that you buy at the store. Azaleas and a number of other vines and other species that can be found in those more wet environments. That's just a quick rundown of those individual plant species. I think I've used up about all my time, but there are hundreds of species in the magnolia family, some even found in Asia. And as you can imagine, with over 90 million years of evolution, there's many different characteristics and phenologies that they have across their range. But in Texas, we're right there at their western edge. So southern magnolia and sweet bay are really the only two widely distributed. And you kind of have to go to the eastern, fourth or fifth of the state to find them growing in any abundance. But where you find them, they can be pretty striking during certain times of year. So if you'd like more information about these plant communities or where to see them, I've got a couple of websites here. The Big Thicket National Preserve has a great description of their plant communities and where to find them at that website. My good friend Matt Buckingham has a great blog and photos documenting some of the vegetation that's there. He also has a great Instagram documenting some of those, A Naturalist Journey. I think you'd really enjoy his photography and write-ups of some of these systems and how they function and the ecology of East Texas. And then Parks and Wildlife, we've got some information and where to see these and where they may occur with a map at that there below, talking about the Western Gulf Coastal Plain, Seepage Swamp, and Baygal system. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Megan and Charles, to wrap us up.
Well, thanks a lot, Tim, for a great presentation on magnolias. Thanks again to our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, InView Range and Pasture, Quail Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas Brigades, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We appreciate your support of Plant Party. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and thank you for attending the 13th Plant Party webinar. Again, Plant Party is a quarterly advanced plant webinar training series brought to you by USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Our next Plant Party will be on March 20th on Cooking Up Natives, so bring your appetite for some plant fun. We'll send an email with more information to all the past registrants. On behalf of Megan, Tim, and myself, we'd like to wish you and your families a very Merry Christmas and a happy 2024. See you next year.